wealth, privilege, Ivy League success. Thomas Gilbert Jr. had it all. But on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Manhattan, a single gunshot shattered the illusion. A respected hedge fund manager found dead. His own son accused of pulling the trigger. What could drive a Princeton graduate to kill the man who gave him everything? The news spread fast. A wealthy financier, shot inside his multi-million-dollar Manhattan apartment. At first, it looked like a suicide, until police took a closer look. The victim, 70-year-old Thomas Gilbert Sr., wasn't just any businessman. He built a successful hedge fund, moved in elite circles, and provided a life of comfort for his family. His son, Thomas Gilbert Jr., grew up in privilege. Private schools, an Ivy League education, a future filled with opportunity. But beneath the surface, his life was unraveling. Then there was Shelley Gilbert, the devoted wife and mother. She walked into the apartment that day, expecting a quiet afternoon. Instead, she found her husband dead and her son missing. What she told investigators would change everything. Thomas Gilbert Sr. was born in 1945 into a life of affluence. He attended prestigious institutions, including Phillips Andover Academy, where he excelled in soccer, squash, and tennis. At Princeton University, he majored in the Woodrow Wilson School and continued his athletic pursuits. Later, he earned a degree from Harvard Business School. In 2011, he founded Wainscott Capital Partners, a hedge fund focusing on biotechnology and healthcare investments. Despite his professional success, he remained a devoted family man. Shelley Gilbert, Tommy's mother, was a supportive figure in his life. After the tragic incident, she stood by her son, financing his defense and psychiatric evaluations, even at great personal expense. Her unwavering support highlighted the complexities of familial bonds amidst unimaginable circumstances. This family's story, marked by success and tragedy, captivated New York's elite and the broader public, prompting discussions on mental health, privilege, and the unforeseen challenges within seemingly perfect lives. Thomas Gilbert Jr. grew up surrounded by wealth and expectation. Raised in an Upper East Side townhouse and summering in the Hamptons, he had every advantage: private schools, exclusive social circles, a clear path to success. His father, a disciplined and accomplished financier, instilled the values of hard work and ambition. His mother, Shelley, provided unwavering support, even as troubling signs emerged. At Deerfield Academy, an elite boarding school, Tommy was known as intelligent, reserved, and intensely private. He excelled in academics, earning top grades in mathematics and languages. At Princeton, he studied economics, following in his father's footsteps. But behind the polished exterior, something was unraveling. Friends from Princeton recalled shifts in his behavior: social withdrawal, paranoia, and outbursts of aggression. He became obsessed with conspiracy theories, convinced people were out to get him. His once promising future became uncertain as he drifted between odd jobs and startup ventures that never took off. By his late 20s, his instability was impossible to ignore. He was frequently kicked out of apartments, burned through money, and exhibited unpredictable behavior. There were whispers of drug use, stimulants, hallucinogens, and an increasing dependence on prescription medication. His parents, once supportive, began to worry. The trust fund payments they provided were enabling his downward spiral, but when they tried to rein him in, the situation took a dangerous turn. Thomas Gilbert Jr.'s relationship with his parents had always been complicated, but by 2014, it had become volatile. His father, a disciplined and pragmatic businessman, had grown frustrated with his son's lack of direction. At 30 years old, Tommy wasn't working, wasn't paying his own bills, and showed no interest in changing. His mother, Shelley, remained his strongest advocate. She defended him when others expressed concern, believing his struggles were part of a phase he would outgrow. But as his paranoia deepened and his anger grew more unpredictable, even she began to fear what he might do. The arguments with his father became more frequent. Tommy felt controlled, convinced his parents were trying to cut him off. His father had already reduced his monthly allowance and was considering pulling financial support entirely. For a man who had never needed to fend for himself, this was a breaking point. In the months leading up to the crime, the warning signs escalated. He had been evicted from multiple apartments, banned from social clubs, and had violent outbursts that left friends uneasy. He had even confronted his father in the past, demanding money and making veiled threats. But no one expected what would happen next. January 4, 2015. A cold Sunday afternoon in Manhattan. Shelley Gilbert had just returned home when her son called. His request was simple: he wanted to talk to his father alone. She didn't think twice. Tommy had visited before, and despite their strained relationship, she never imagined what was about to unfold. She stepped out of the apartment, leaving her husband and son behind. Less than 15 minutes later, a single gunshot rang out. When Shelley returned, she found a horrifying scene. Her husband, Thomas Gilbert Jr., lay motionless on the floor of their bedroom, a bullet wound to his head. A Glock .40 caliber handgun rested beside him. His wallet had been removed, his credit cards taken. The room was undisturbed, no sign of struggle. At first glance, it looked like a suicide. But something wasn't right. The placement of the gun raised suspicions. It rested on his chest, as if placed there deliberately. The wound showed no signs of a close-contact shot, unusual for self-inflicted gunfire. And then, the most telling detail of all, Tommy was gone. Investigators moved quickly. Surveillance footage from the apartment building told a different story. Tommy had arrived wearing a hoodie and gloves, carrying a plastic bag. Less than 15 minutes later, he left, calm, composed, and empty-handed. Inside that bag had been the gun, later discarded near his father's body. Police tracked him down the next day at his Chelsea apartment. Inside, they found boxes of ammunition, blank credit cards, and evidence that suggested he had planned the murder. His arrest was swift. His reaction? Cold. Detached. As if none of this concerned him. The question was no longer who had killed Thomas Gilbert Sr., that was clear. Now, the focus shifted to why. With Thomas Gilbert Jr. in custody, investigators began unraveling the motive behind the murder. The answer was as simple as it was disturbing: money. For years, Tommy had been living off his parents' wealth. He didn't have a steady job, made no effort to support himself, and relied on a monthly allowance from his father. But as his behavior became more erratic, his father decided to cut back. By early 2015, Tommy's allowance had been reduced to $400 a week. For a man who had never been forced to fend for himself, this was intolerable. The night before the murder, Gilbert Sr. confided in a friend that he planned to cut his son's allowance even further, hoping it would push him to take responsibility for his life. Tommy, on the other hand, saw it as betrayal. His actions on the day of the crime were chillingly calculated. He stopped by a nearby gun shop just weeks before, asking vague questions about purchasing a firearm. He had also researched ways to make a killing look like a suicide. Then, after luring his mother out of the apartment, he executed his plan. But in court, his defense team argued a different angle. They painted Tommy as a man suffering from untreated schizophrenia, claiming his mental illness drove him to kill. His mother, despite everything, supported this narrative. She insisted her son needed psychiatric care, not prison. The prosecution, however, saw no sign of delusion, only entitlement and rage. They highlighted his history of threats, past violent outbursts, and how methodically he had covered his tracks. This wasn't the impulsive act of a man in crisis, they argued. It was cold-blooded murder. Now, the jury had to decide, was Thomas Gilbert Jr. a mentally ill man in need of help, or was he a privileged son who killed out of pure resentment? The trial of Thomas Gilbert Jr. began in 2019, 4 years after the murder. The courtroom was packed. On one side, prosecutors painted him as a cold and entitled killer who murdered his father over money. On the other, his defense team insisted he was a deeply disturbed man suffering from untreated schizophrenia. His behavior in court only fueled the debate. At times, he appeared calm and emotionless. Other times, he lashed out, disrupting proceedings with bizarre outbursts. He accused his lawyers of conspiring against him, refused to take his medication, and even claimed that his food in jail was being poisoned. The prosecution didn't buy it. They argued that Tommy had a history of avoiding responsibility, using mental illness as an excuse when convenient. They presented evidence of his premeditation, how he had scouted a gun shop weeks before, researched how to stage a suicide, and lured his mother out of the apartment to ensure no witnesses. His mother, Shelley, took the stand in his defense. Through tears, she described his descent into paranoia, how he had once been a brilliant student but lost himself in delusions. She begged the jury to see her son as a sick man, not a murderer. But the jury saw the facts. After 2 days of deliberation, they returned their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder and 2 counts of criminal possession of a weapon. When the sentence was handed down, 30 years to life, Tommy showed no reaction. No remorse. Just the same vacant stare he had worn since the day of his arrest. A privileged son. A brilliant mind lost to darkness. A father's life taken over something as trivial as money. The Gilbert case was over. But the questions it left behind still linger. Was this the tragic result of untreated mental illness, or was it the ultimate act of entitlement? With Thomas Gilbert Jr. sentenced to 30 years to life, his story didn't end in the courtroom. His mother, Shelley, never stopped fighting for him. She insisted that her son was mentally ill, not a murderer, and that prison was the wrong place for him. In interviews, she described how she had spent years trying to get him help, only to be ignored by the system. Legal experts debated the case. Some believed the jury got it right. Tommy's crime was calculated, and his refusal to take medication showed he understood his actions. Others argued that his mental illness was undeniable, pointing to his history of delusions, paranoia, and erratic behavior long before the murder. Inside prison, Tommy's behavior remained unpredictable. Reports surfaced of him refusing psychiatric treatment and lashing out at staff. His legal team attempted appeals, citing his deteriorating mental state, but so far, all efforts have failed. The tragedy of the Gilbert family became a cautionary tale. A wealthy son who had every advantage but never found stability. A father who tried tough love but paid the ultimate price. A mother caught between justice and unconditional love. In the end, the case raised questions far beyond the crime itself. Could this have been prevented? Did wealth and privilege shield Tommy for too long? And how do you separate mental illness from responsibility when the line between them is so blurred? The answers remain unclear. But for the Gilbert family, one thing is certain: their lives will never be the same. Years have passed since Thomas Gilbert Jr. was convicted, yet his case still sparks debate. Was he a privileged son who killed out of entitlement, or a man suffering from untreated schizophrenia who never received the help he desperately needed? His mother, Shelley, remains his most vocal supporter. In interviews, she insists that her son was failed by the mental health system. She has spent years advocating for his transfer to a psychiatric facility rather than a prison cell, but the legal system has refused to budge. Despite her pleas, Tommy remains behind bars, serving out his sentence with little hope for early release. Inside prison, his erratic behavior continues. Reports suggest he has refused medication, displayed paranoid tendencies, and kept to himself, avoiding interactions with other inmates. Some see this as further proof of his illness. Others argue it's just another example of his unwillingness to take responsibility. The Gilbert case has since been examined in true crime documentaries, books, and legal discussions about wealth, privilege, and mental illness. Some argue that if Tommy had been from a different background, he might have been institutionalized long before the crime ever occurred. Others believe his actions were too deliberate to ignore, regardless of his mental state. For those who knew Thomas Gilbert Sr., the focus remains on the life that was lost. A successful financier. A father who wanted the best for his son. A man who tried to set boundaries, only to pay the ultimate price. In the end, the Gilbert case is more than just a murder story. It's a glimpse into the dark side of privilege, the failings of the mental health system, and the unsettling reality that even the wealthiest families can be torn apart by tragedy. The final chapter has yet to be written. But for Tommy, locked away with no foreseeable future, the life he once knew is already over. The Gilbert case remains one of the most unsettling crimes to emerge from New York's elite circles. A son who had everything but took the one thing he could never replace. A father who tried to instill discipline, only to meet a tragic end. A mother caught between grief and loyalty. Years later, the debates continue. Could this murder have been prevented if Thomas Gilbert Jr. had received psychiatric care earlier? Or was it the inevitable consequence of a privileged man who had never been held accountable? Legal experts still dissect the case, using it as an example of the fine line between mental illness and criminal responsibility. True crime enthusiasts revisit the details, trying to piece together what truly drove Tommy to kill. And Shelley Gilbert, despite everything, remains steadfast in her belief that her son belongs in a hospital, not a prison cell. But no amount of discussion can change what happened that day. No court ruling can undo the loss of Thomas Gilbert Sr. His death serves as a chilling reminder that even the most successful, well-connected families are not immune to tragedy. The world has moved on. New York's elite have returned to their routines. But inside a maximum security prison, Tommy Gilbert sits alone, locked away in the very isolation he once craved. And for the Gilbert family, the nightmare will never truly end. The case of Thomas Gilbert Jr. is one that forces us to ask difficult questions. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Was justice truly served? And how do we handle the intersection of wealth, privilege, and mental illness in our society? What do you think? Was this an entitled son who refused to grow up, or a man suffering from a serious mental illness that went untreated for too long? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more true crime stories that uncover the shocking realities behind real-life cases, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode.